Welcome, everybody, to the Legal Writing Online Lectures. In this series of lectures, we'll be talking about grammar and style. Let's get started. We'll exclusively be using the Chicago Manual of Style in these lectures. And in particular, the section on grammar and usage. I suggest that you go to chicagomanualofstyle.org and purchase the online version. It's fantastic. You can search, you can access it anywhere you have internet connection. I use it all the time to double check questions I have about grammar and style and other things as well. So the outline of the Chicago Manual of Style is more than just grammar and style. It talks about the publishing process, the manuscript preparation. How do you format illustrations, tables? Rights, permission. How does a book look? Or how should it look? How should you format the book? Then that's kind of part one of the Chicago Manual of Style. Part two refers to style and usage. So in one piece of that will be grammar and usage. And this particular section is written by Brian Gardner. If you don't know Brian, he has some fantastic books on legal style, legal English that you can that are great books. And he wrote the particular section on grammar and usage, which we'll be going through in these lectures in detail. But the Chicago Manual of Style also talks about punctuation usage, numbers, abbreviations. How do we use languages other than English? Equations, mathematics in type. And then the third, so that's part two. And then part three is citation guide. We won't talk about that in these lectures. We will use the Blue Book and exclusively the Blue Book. But for the Chicago Manual Style, we'll be really focusing in detail on the grammar and usage sections. Again, the online version is fantastic. So, where do we start? Start at the beginning. The parts of speech. So, in general, it's generally thought that there are a few different parts of speech. You can think of it as, we'll talk about 8 parts of speech. Of course, there's kind of a, you can think about these in different ways. And in the so-called kind of schools of grammatical thought, there are different ideas, right? So there are different ways that we can organize our speech. But in general, there's usually held that there's 8 parts of speech. And again, I need to emphasize in this class that these are kind of considered rules for usage. But the main rule should be that the English should be readable, right? To that end, we fashion these rules so that our English can be more readable, right? And I want to emphasize too that these are rules, but given our number one rule of readability, that means that these rules have a certain element of flexibility. We're not bound to these rules if it makes something more readable. So that should be our number one concern. Okay, what are the parts of speech? Nouns, pronouns, adjectives, adverbs, verbs, prepositions, conjunctions, and interjections. And we'll discuss these one by one throughout these lectures. I'm going to try to wrap up the grammar and style lectures in 6 separate lectures, but we'll see how that goes. So in this lecture, we'll focus on nouns and pronouns. So noun. Now we're moving to the rules of the Chicago Manual of Style. This starts in 5.4. So nouns can be tangible or intangible. This cup, a car, tangible. Something like philosophy, those sort of things. Intangible. Tangible meaning there it is, you can see it. Intangible, not so much. You could have a common noun or a proper noun. Common noun being something like car, right? A proper noun, a Lexus. Could be the name of a specific person, place, or thing. And then we have this idea of count noun and mass noun, or when I grew up, it was uncountable. So countable or uncountable. Countable means that it can be counted. The noun can be counted. A cup, a car. Or mass nouns, things that can't be counted. The example the Chicago Manual of Style gives is information, salt, cream. Those things aren't countable, right? So you wouldn't say something like a salt. You could say a grain of salt, but not a salt. And we'll talk more about that later. So nouns in general, we have tangible, intangible, common, proper, countable, uncountable, or mass nouns. And moving to common noun. As I mentioned, the common noun is a generic name for any item in a class or group. It's not capitalized like proper nouns are. Unless, of course, it appears at the beginning of a sentence. In that case, it'll be capitalized. Or if it's part of a title. And then we have our capitalization rules that we talk about in the Blue Book lectures. So now for common nouns, we have kind of three subtypes of common nouns that we talk about. The Chicago Manual style talks about subcategories. Those are the concrete, abstract, and collective. So concrete noun, they are something that is real, something that we can perceive with our physical senses. We can see this cup. I can smell my tea. I can taste my tea. Right, this building, a car. You can sense the wind. You can feel the texture of this desk. So that's kind of the concrete noun. So abstract nouns refer to something that you cannot see with the senses. Joy, happiness, right? Expectation, those sorts of nouns. You can see when people are happy, but you can't technically see happiness or joy. You can feel joyful. But this is getting into the weeds. Just realize abstract nouns denote things that you can't physically perceive. So the collective noun, it is a kind of concrete noun, but refers to a collection or group of people. Like a crowd of people, a flock of birds, that sort of thing. And then finally, a common noun is usually preceded by what's called a determiner. Sometimes we say an article or other word that talks about or indicates the number or definiteness of the noun. So, a cup, a car. Some person, etc. So now moving on to proper nouns. So proper nouns meaning the name of a specific person, place, or thing, Mark Shope is my name. I live in Hsinchu, Taiwan, or just Taiwan, capital T, Taiwan. It could be the name of a book, the name of an article, the title of a movie, etc. Again, they can be singular or plural. Mark, or the example they give in the Chicago Manual of Style, the Great Lakes, the Twin Cities in the United States. It is always capitalized unless the convention of that specific person, place, or thing is to not capitalize it, in which case you would use whatever convention that they're using for that particular proper name. And the Chicago Manual of Style points out that some proper nouns have developed common noun counterparts. Now, what does this mean? The example they give is China. China is a country, but we also use a word China relating to porcelain, specifically porcelain from China, from capital C, China. But we'll call that China. So just realize that some proper names have shifted to having a common noun counterpart. Moving to mass nouns. Remember that mass nouns, this is, when I grew up, it was uncountable noun. So we had countable and uncountable. So, and it's either uncountable because it's an aggregation of things, like we refer to salt, cream, or it is abstract, right? Like evidence, that sort of thing. So you wouldn't say an evidence. You could say a piece of evidence or one type of evidence, but you wouldn't say an evidence. It's uncountable. So a mass noun typically don't have plural forms. You wouldn't say two salts or two luggages is the example the Chicago Manual of Style gives. And it can stand alone or with a determiner. That is other than an indefinite article, right? So the example is, you could say some music, the music is beautiful, but you wouldn't say like a music, that sort of thing. So in the legal sense, some evidence, you could say some evidence, the evidence at trial, but you wouldn't say something like an evidence presented at trial. Although you could say a piece of evidence, which is another, it's a totally different concept. So those are our traditional classifications of nouns. Now moving to the properties of nouns. So in general, the properties of nouns. We have case and number, which we'll talk about both in the next two. Gender is sometimes considered gender and person is considered properties, but we'll focus on case, number, and then we'll talk about gender. So what do we mean when we're talking about noun? So nouns and pronouns will have case, and only nouns and pronouns will have case. So the case refers to the relationship between a noun and the other words in the sentence. And this is from the Chicago Manual Style. So, and among those, there are two. The common form, what we'll talk about, or the genitive form. And when I grew up, that was called the possessive form. It's not, the genitive form includes possessive and some other things, so saying possessive does not totally encapsulate the concept. But for me, I still say possessive form. And that's how I was taught in grade school. Common form is the regular form. The possessive form, you would add an apostrophe S or just an apostrophe, depending on how the specific word ends. If it ends in an S, you would do something a little bit different, which we'll talk about later. So we have common and possessive, or genitive. Number, noun number, just basically shows whether one thing is being referred to or a number of things are being referred to. So cup is the singular form. Cups, adding an S, would be the plural form. Many, many different cups. So that's noun and number. So noun gender. In English, nouns really don't have gender. Relating to other languages. So in other languages, a thing might have a certain gender, which will determine what determiner is used or the other parts of speech that will need to be used for that particular noun. But in English, we basically don't have that. Now moving to the plural form of nouns. So we'll talk about in Rule 5.13 plurals generally. There are a couple of basic rules that we'll talk about, but unfortunately in the English language, there are tons of exceptions to the plural form of words. So what do? We have the Chicago Manual of Style ready, or a dictionary ready to help us with the plural forms and the spelling of the plural forms. We all kind of know the general rule, adding an S, or IES, that sort of thing, but there are lots of exceptions that we need to check periodically to be thorough with our spelling. So in 5.14, we talk about plural form with singular sense. What does this mean? So some nouns are plural in form, meaning there's an S there, but it's singular in use. Right? So the example given is news. News, the news, good news, that sort of thing. That's a plural form. It has an S. Same things with economics. That is plural in form, but singular in use, in meaning. Sometimes there will be a something like mice and mouse. So again, the plural form of mouse is mice. So you have an entirely different kind of spelling with regard to that plural form. So moving to 5.15, in this we are talking about plural form proper nouns. So the geographical names are generally treated as singular. If it's a plural geographical name, it's typically considered singular if it refers to a single entity. And the example is the United States. Right? There's 50 states. It's an S, but we're considering that as a single entity. So we consider that it's treated as singular. So you wouldn't say something like the United States are a young nation, right? You would say the United States, and this is the example the Chicago Manual of Style gives, the United States is a young country, right? Because we're treating United States in singular rather than plural. There are always exceptions, but that's kind of the general rule. So now kind of these tricky anomalies in plurals. There's a couple of exceptions. that don't use the singular plural kind of separation. So some mass nouns like furniture, spaghetti, and wheat are the examples. They'll only have a singular form. And things like scissors, slacks, right? Slacks or pants, what we would say in the U.S. These are only plurals. So you wouldn't say something like the furniture are pretty, or you would say the furniture is pretty or is nice or is comfortable, something like that. So in the other example, like with scissors, for example, for a cup, you would say the cup is in my hand, right? If I had some scissors, you have one scissors, right? I'd say the scissors are in my hand, even though it's a one scissor. But you'd say the scissors are in my hand. The cup is in my hand. The furniture is comfortable. That sort of thing. Now moving on to case. We talked about case earlier. What is case? As I mentioned before, the case is the relationship between a noun or pronoun and the other words in a sentence. So, we'll talk about the nominative function and the objective function. We'll talk about the genitive case, the of genitive. So, the nominative function. This is sometimes called the subjective function. And that's how I grew up learning it. So you'd have subjective and objective case. So the subjective denotes the person, place, or thing about which the assertion in a clause is made, basically. I teach a class, right? I am the subject. Mark teaches a class. That would be the subjective. Now, contrast that with the objective function, sometimes called the accusative, but I grew up calling it the objective. Could denote two things. The thing acted upon or acted on by the transitive verb in active voice. Or, so the example given in the Chicago Manual of Style is the balloon carried a pilot and a passenger. So the pilot and the passenger are being acted on. They're being carried by the balloon. Therefore, the pilot and passenger are objective. Or the second thing could be a preposition, connected by connective, such as a preposition. So you could say, put the cup on the table. So the object of the preposition, table, right? And we used to always call it the object of the preposition, meaning you have a preposition and then following a noun. The noun is the object of the preposition in that sense. So nominative and objective, or subjective and objective. And then the genitive case. This would be what I also refer to as the possessive. But if you said to me possessive case, I would understand that you mean the genitive case. And there would be no issue with that. So, but the possessive case, the genitive case, and we'll see how it's more than just possessive. It can denote ownership, right, which is this possessive case, but it also can denote a relationship. The example could be the teacher's cup, right? Kind of ownership, right? The relationship is ownership here, but doesn't necessarily need to be ownership. It could be the professor's research assistant, right? So there's a relationship there. It could mean agency. In the example, you could be the company's lawyer. So the company has a lawyer. The company doesn't own the lawyer. It's not possessive. And there's more than a relationship. There's kind of agency. You could say the company's representative, right? Or, any situation where there's agency, like in terms of principal agent concepts. It could be a simple description, something like the example they give is like a summer's day, meaning a day in the summer. It could mean the role of a subject. Meaning something like a student's application. The student applied, right? It could be the object, the role of an object, sorry. And the example they give, which is great, is the prisoner's release, right? Someone who is released from prison. And in English, sometimes we have this, and this is the final one. It basically kind of shorthand for an of phrase. So the example they give is 1 hour's delay. You would could also say that that's a delay of 1 hour. right? So kind of just a shorthand, right, for this of construction. So now moving to this of genitive. So here, of might precede a noun or a proper name to express relationship, agency, or possession. So, for example, a friend of mine, right? My friend. A friend of Mark. Mark's friend. That sort of thing. And why do we do this? It's up to you, but one way you can do it's helpful when a double genitive is called for. So the example given is an idea of Hill's, a friend of my grandfather's, right? So a friend of my grandfather's being apostrophe S, right? So helpful there using the of with the possessive form. So then in joint and separate genitives. So this kind of arises when you have kind of two nouns. So for example, two people. And there's a relationship there. How do you deal with the genitives in that situation? So, for example, the example they give in the Chicago Manual Style is Peter and Harriet's correspondence. Is that Peter's correspondence and Harriet's correspondence? Is it a separate correspondence? No. If you're using Peter and Harriet's is apostrophe S, then that refers to the correspondence between Peter and Harriet. Now, if Peter and Harriet possess something separately, so for example, what I refer to as if you have Peter's correspondence and Harriet's correspondence, then both would take the genitive form. So Peter's apostrophe S and Harriet's apostrophe S correspondence. So there you have, Peter has his correspondence with, as he sees fit, separate of Harriet's, and Harriet's has her correspondence. Now moving to appositives. What's an appositive? So an appositive is a noun element that follows another noun element to describe it or identify it. So in the we have the example, George Washington, our first president, was born in Virginia. This our first president is the appositive. Mark Shope, a professor at Yangming Jiao Tong University, was born in the United States. So a professor at Yangming Jiao Tong University is the appositive. Okay, moving on now to this idea of some variations. That is, nouns as adjectives or nouns as verbs. So basically, when words can also, nouns can also function as other parts of speech, like adjectives or verbs. So this kind of transition, right, noun to adjective or noun to verb transition, so specifically talking about adjectives, happens when a noun modifies another noun. Right, the example given is the morning newspaper. So morning is a noun. Modifying another noun, the newspaper, to mean the newspaper that comes in the morning, right? Now, nouns as verbs, we're doing kind of the same thing. English nouns, this will happen. It's common for nouns to transition into verbs. The example they give is mainstreaming. You know, more school districts are mainstreaming pupils. You have things like Google, right? Googling now. Google it. It's meaning search, right? Google was originally a company name, transitioning into all kinds of different meanings, transitioning into different parts of speech. So that's transitioning nouns into adjectives or verbs. Sorry, moving to pronouns. Pronouns defined and the antecedents of pronouns. So pronouns are basically a substitute for a noun in English. Can be used in two ways. A substitute for an express noun or pronoun. We do this sometimes to avoid repetition. It can also be used to stand in the place of an understood noun. So, for example, sometimes we'll say something like, Mark, are you bringing your books? You could just say something like, are you bringing your books? In the sentence. If it's understood that your is referring to me. Now, we usually, in the legal sense, pronouns, when we substitute pronouns, we get into trouble. So you should be careful, meaning that the in contract language, or if you're filing a brief, you might want to stay away from using a pronoun. So, for example, if you're in contract language, if you start to refer to the buyer or the seller as, if they're individuals, as she or he, this might get confusing, whether or not, okay, are you talking about the buyer now or the seller now? What are you talking about? Sometimes it's just easier to eliminate the pronouns and stick with the regular noun or the defined noun that you're using. So, and then this idea of antecedents of pronouns. So the antecedent of pronoun is the thing that the pronoun is referring to, the earlier noun, right? And a rule of thumb is, for me, you try to use pronouns in the same sentence. Once you start adding pronouns where the antecedent is in the previous sentence or the previous paragraph, then it gets tricky. What are we referring to here? And for me, that's confusing. So now moving to the 4 properties of pronouns. Again, we have number, person, gender, and case with pronouns. So the pronoun needs to agree with the antecedent in number, person, and gender. This is called pronoun antecedent agreement. So if you're referring to me, I would prefer that you would use he or him in order that pronoun antecedent will agree. There are other preferences that other people might have, which is a subject of a different course, but I would say use the pronoun that is preferred by a person or the thing. And with regard to pronoun number, so the pronoun's number is guided by the antecedent. If it's an antecedent, if the antecedent is a singular, then the pronoun's singular. If the antecedent is plural, then you use the plural pronoun. So for the examples they give is, or maybe a cup and its owner. A book, sorry. I guess that would not be a great example, but a book and its cover. A book or a cup and his owner. The dogs or the cups and the dogs and their owner, right? So the dogs, more than one. And then this idea of nominative case misuse for objective. In this situation, the objective case governs personal pronouns, what the Chicago Manual of Style says, as direct objects of verbs. So, for example, they give call me tomorrow right? So the object call me, not call I tomorrow. Call me tomorrow. Write me a letter, not write I a letter. And of course, the objects of prepositions. Makes sense to me is the example they give. So then kind of one slip that the Chicago of Manual style talks about would be, do you say for you and me or for you and I? So if we use objective case for objects of prepositions, right? So for you and me, right? Because me is the objective form of the personal pronoun, so we wouldn't. So a poorer choice would be for you and I. A better choice would be for you and me. So form of personal pronouns. We have this kind of idea of first person, second person, third person, that sort of thing. So the pronoun will reveal its form if you're referring to the speaker. So if you're referring to the speaker, this is first person idea. If you're the thing spoken to would be the second person, or the thing spoken of, this is third person. And so in this sense, they show the source, right? Goal and topic of something that's being said, as well as the number, gender, and case. So the identification of personal pronouns. As I mentioned before, the first person is the speaker. I need some more tea. The second person shows who's being spoken to. You should hand in your assignment tonight. And the third person shows who is spoken of. So she is in class, right? It's this third person. I'm not speaking to the she. I'm referring to the she as this person. So we use the third person. So now agreement of the personal pronoun with a noun. The personal pronoun agrees with the noun in gender and number, right? So for example, Mark teaches, and he teaches, okay. And then adding gender. Personal pronouns is gender. So here, only the third person singular pronouns directly express gender. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. in a later lecture. So now personal pronouns after a linking verb. So in general, if a pronoun is serving as the complement of a be verb, which is a kind of linking verb or other linking verb, it needs to be in the nominative case. So for the example they give is, it was she who asked for a meeting. So the linking verb was, it was she, right? It was I who asked for the meeting. And then finally, the singular use of they. So there was a time, I guess, where he may have been universally accepted as a generic pronoun, referring to someone of an unspecific gender. Whether or not that's really the case is a source of another course. But now commonly people won't accept that, so they'll substitute they, them, their, themselves, that sort of thing for, and that's the third person plural pronouns, right? Third person they, them in the plural, they, more than one. They'll substitute that for this generic singular pronoun. So, which is okay. I think it's fine. Some people still probably won't prefer to do that. They might say his or her, that sort of thing. And then in general, I would say a person's stated preference for a specific pronoun should be respected. Now moving to relative pronouns. So who versus whom. So in this sense, who and whoever are nominative pronouns. And we can use those as subjects. So whoever said that, or as a predicate nominative. It was who, right? Whom and whomever are objective forms, right? So those before were subjective forms. Whom and whomever, are objective forms used as the object of a verb. You called whom, right? To whom are you referring? So one example they give in the Chicago Manual style is a poor form would be, whom should I say is calling? A better form would be, who should I say is calling? So who, whoever, nominative pronouns, whom and whomever are the objective forms. So that was a lot. Thanks everybody again. Welcome to the course, and I'll see you in the next video.